Thank you, Martin. My name is Homi Karas. I'm a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development program here at Brookings, and I'm going to moderate this next session. So for the next hour and a quarter or so, we're going to switch and talk really about long-term growth, and in particular, we're going to talk about two big drivers: what's going to happen to productivity and what are the sources of underlying productivity growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, how does all of that relate to the changing demographics of our world, and specifically to what in most countries is the problem of aging and a much older workforce. So we've got a great panel. What we're going to do is each of the four panel members is going to come up and give a short presentation. Then we're going to have a panel discussion and then open it up to Q&A. So the first of our panel members who's going to present to us is Dr. Jana Remes. Jana is a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute. All right. We're first going to have James Manica start. Luckily, he is also a director at the McKinsey Global Institute. He is also a senior partner at McKinsey & Company. And very importantly for us, James is also on the President Obama's Global Development Council and has served as the vice chairman of that council. He has been a member of the National Innovation Advisory Board. And for those of you who think that this is all just a job for economists, etc., and all this stuff on productivity isn't really rocket science, he has been a visiting scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he holds a DPhil from Oxford. I'm actually going to introduce everybody so that I don't have to keep bouncing up and down. So after James will come Jana Remes, who is a partner at McKinsey Global Institute and author of a wonderful new report on global growth. That will serve as the basis for the presentations from both James and Jana, but in particular, anybody who has followed the McKinsey Global Institute work knows that if you want to think about what's happening to the world economy and big trends in the world economy, this is the go-to place and resource, whether it's on topics of productivity or competitiveness, urbanization, what's going to happen to natural resources and climate change. This is the source of some of the best data, actually, that we have, and an ability to synthesize it all together. So Jana has been writing on these subjects for a very long time, and so I think brings not just this particular volume to the discussion, but also this combination of all of the other background work that she's been doing over the years. After Jana, hopefully, we will have Marco Annunziata. Yes, no change in order? Great. Just let me know, if you want me to moderate these things. Marco is the chief economist for General Electric. When we think about productivity and about the frontiers of growth, we always think about how big companies are going to be pushing out the frontiers. But he's also he's a prize-winning author. He's done written books on technology, on work and jobs, on connectedness. Many of these issues on trade, how countries will actually come together and think about their comparative advantage, not just their own domestic economies. And he holds a PhD from Princeton University in economics. And then last but not least, We have Martin Bailey. Martin is a senior fellow here at Brookings. He holds the Bernard Schwartz Chair in Economic Policy Development. He is a slightly more mature version of Jason Furman, having held the same position a few years earlier. Much more experienced, of course, Martin, and with many war stories under his belt. But he was also a principal at McKinsey & Company and at the Global Institute in Washington. He holds a PhD in economics from MIT. James.
Homi, thank you, and good morning. Thank you to Brookings for hosting us this morning. I think as Jason put it, there's no other more important topic in economics than growth and, I would add, prosperity. And so one of the things that my colleague Yana and I wanted to do is to share some perspectives from some of the research we've been doing, but in particular talk about where we are, how we got here, and what we might do about what the future holds ahead of us. So a brief history. The last 50 years have been pretty extraordinary. The global economy has expanded by sixfold in the last 50 years. And it's actually important to particularly take note of two features of this growth. One is the fact that we've expanded to the right. In other words, 50 years ago, the global economy had to cater for about 2 billion people. Now we've actually grown that to close to over 6 billion people. So that's extraordinary growth and in terms of the people that the economy has had to cater for. If you look to the north, going up the scale, we've also increased GDP per capita quite extraordinarily from where it used to be 50 years ago at roughly 20,000, now to about what it's gone up to where it is now. It's grown by about 2.4%. That's extraordinary growth in both directions. It's also important to know that the US has actually led the way. So even though the US 50 years ago was already at a high base in terms of GDP per capita, it actually further improved on that in the last 50 years. So that's worth noting. It's also important to note that China and India and Brazil were probably the big additions as we grew to the right in terms of adding more people who the economy had to cater for. It's also quite useful to put this in a historical perspective. So the last 50 years are pretty extraordinary, and we had far, far higher growth rates than we'd had in previous periods. The chart here compares the 200-year period between 1700 and the 1900s, and then the period just before 1950. And you can see how extraordinary the growth has been in the last 50 years. The question now becomes, what happens next? And what does it look like going forward? But before we do that, it's also important to see what the elements have been that have driven the growth that we've seen in the last 50 years in particular. And as you can see from a classic growth decomposition, we've benefited in roughly equal measure from growth in labor supply and employment growth, as well as growth in productivity, roughly in equal measure. Much of the growth in employment growth was a result of increased fertility rates, the baby boomer generation, the demographic dividend. That drove a big part of the growth that we saw in employment growth. The growth in productivity mostly came from, as the global economy shifted from mostly agricultural economies to more industrialized economies, and increasingly also even to the service sector economy, and people moving into cities. So those two effects, roughly in equal measure, got us to where we are. So as we think about what might happen next, we think it's quite important to examine both of these components and see what they hold for us as we look forward. The first thing we're going to make a point about is to note that, in fact, we may be running into some demographic headwinds. If you remember, one of the two components for growth was growth and employment growth. And what this chart shows is basically how the global population has been growing over time. And as you can see, there's been a slowdown in population growth. The light green shows growth in terms of the young and the elderly. The blue shows the aging of the working age population. What you'll notice is that between 1964 and 2014, we actually had a growth in working age population as a share of the overall global population. But that is starting to slow, if you look what it might look like in 2064. So if you think about it, in the previous period, we had benefited from this roughly 1.7% growth in employment growth. If you project that forward just based on demographics, that growth is going to look more like 0.3%. So that's a real dramatic slowdown. And it's actually interesting when you look at this from the point of view of different countries. What this chart shows places here both different individual countries, but also groups of countries. So as you can see, much of the world, in terms of employment growth, is going to basically, employment is going to peak in roughly 2050. The top line shows the growth in labor supply globally, and unfortunately the line falls exactly where the point is, which is in roughly 2050 is roughly when it peaks. And that's close to when it's going to peak in emerging countries. But if you look at the line below, where that little triangle is, shows roughly that in the advanced economies, employment growth is mostly going to peak around about 2020, thereabouts, based on current trends. And you'll see when that will happen in different countries. It's already happened, by the way, in some countries. You can see where countries like Russia are, for example. It'll happen much, much later for some countries like India, based on the demographic shape of those countries, as well as in particular countries like Nigeria, which has very, very, very high fertility rates. And in fact, by 2050, it will actually be the third most populous country in the world. So as you can see, the world is aging. Now, from a labor supply standpoint, as I said, the growth rate here looks like it's about 0.3 based on current trends and demographics. That's what you see over to the left. We can do something about this in terms of increasing participation rates and putting more people into the workforce, and that'll get us something. What this shows roughly is we can get as much as, we can improve the growth rate to roughly about 0.6%, in particular, increasing the participation of women in the workforce, mostly outside of the developed economies, getting some more men to participate in the economy who don't today, looking at youth participation, but also looking at the older population. And what you'll see is that for the developed economies, the big boost, such as it is, will come from getting older workers to participate in the economy. In emerging economies, the big boost comes from mostly getting women to participate more fully in the economy. But that at most will get us, in the best case scenario, we'll get the growth rate for labor supply from roughly the 0.3 that we see to about 0.61. So not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things. Let's look at the other piece, which is productivity. Well, productivity, even as high as it's been over the last 50 years, as I said, 1.8% in terms of growth, has varied quite significantly across different countries. As you'll see, the spectacular stars here in the period we're looking at, which is 1964 to today, has mostly been South Korea and Japan. The advanced economies, including the United States, these were already relatively highly productive economies, but even they grew quite a bit. And then you see in the emerging economies, the big growth in terms of productivity has come from countries like China and Turkey. It's also important to note that it still remains quite a striking observation that the advanced economies are still 5 times more productive than the emerging economies. And as you see, there's a bit of a mixed picture here. But this is one of the things at least we've got to work with. If demographics are going to do what demographics are going to do, at least the other part of that we can actually do something about is the productivity side of things. So what could this look like going forward? As I said, demography is demography, and we can do some things about it, but not a whole lot in terms of labor supply. So we're really looking at productivity. So we've got a few scenarios here to contemplate, which mostly focus on what could happen with productivity. So the first scenario, which is the first column here, assumes a growth rate in productivity of 1.2%. That growth rate is really what the growth rate was in the period up to 1964. So if you looked at the prior historical period, 1900s to 1964, that's what the growth rate in productivity was. The middle column is the productivity rate we've had globally in the last 50 years, the 1.8%. The productivity over to the right at 2.5% is a best case in terms of, if you look at the most productive decade we've had is really the decade between 2004 and 2014. And that was the growth rate in productivity in the countries we're talking about, which is the 2.5. But what's striking about this picture in any of these scenarios is that in all of them, this implies a reduction in GDP growth. Because demography is what it is, even at these different growth rates for productivity, we're going to see a reduction in GDP growth. We'll also see a reduction in GDP per capita growth, which is particularly important on the basis that GDP per capita should translate ultimately to prosperity. So this doesn't look very good, except in the one small corner case, at least for GDP per capita, which is the extreme case, which assumes we do the best we've ever done in terms of productivity. Let's go into a little bit more detail. So if we take the middle option and see what does this look like globally. So it shows you on the right, GDP growth historically has been 3.5%. So GDP would then decline globally in these G19 plus Nigeria. We kind of looked at we made up a group of countries here, the G20, which is really G19 plus Nigeria. The growth rate would decline to about 2.1%, which is a reduction in GDP of about 40%. Similarly, you'll see a reduction in GDP per capita of about 19%. Now, of course, this will vary quite a bit across different kinds of countries because of the combination of the mix of their demography, the historical growth rates, and so forth. And what you'll see here is that, for example, for the United States, if you work through the similar math and the similar calculation, the reduction in GDP growth would actually be about 34%, which is quite substantial. And you'll see that the countries that would be impacted by this the most are countries like Germany, as well as even Canada, interestingly enough. Now, this story is not just an advanced economy challenge. It also applies even in the emerging economies. As you can see, even countries like, countries from Brazil to Mexico and even China would see reductions in their GDP growth. The one difference is, you can see obviously, is the case of Nigeria, which is why I wanted to include it here. But that's mostly a function predominantly of its demographics, which affect the labor supply. So the question is, what do we do about this? So before we all get depressed and worried about what I just described here, my colleague Jan is going to hopefully come with some good news, or some promising news.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as James set it up, it is pretty clear that as we look ahead, global growth is going to be a question of productivity growth. And that's a little bit of a challenge for the economists because we don't have a great way of predicting productivity. Alan Blinder famously said a few months ago that every swing in productivity growth in the past has come to us as a surprise. And in many ways, how can we start thinking about global growth when it's really going to depend on productivity growth, which we traditionally have not been very good at doing? What can we say? We obviously don't have any better crystal ball than anyone else around, but what we do have is over 2 decades of studying productivity at the company, industry, and country level across a broad range of countries in the globe. So what we wanted to do in order to shed some fact-based insights into the global growth and productivity challenges is to be really looked at what do we see happening at the productivity levels across different industries around the globe, and what do we see as opportunities to improve those. Obviously, we didn't want to take a 50-year time perspective simply because of the fact that it is a too long a distance to have basically counted on any facts. Degrees of freedom are too long. So we looked at the next 10 years, talked with our colleagues who work with a lot of industries and companies around the globe, and assessed what do we see at the prospects for productivity in the next 10 years. We studied 5 industries: agriculture, food processing, automotive, retail, and healthcare. And what did we find? The good news is that we found plenty of opportunities to improve productivity. What we have here is, I'm not going to go through every single bubble, but the idea is that when we looked at every industry, we saw opportunities both on the left-hand side of the chart. You can see opportunities to close the gap to best performing industries and operations. And on the left-hand side, opportunities to push the frontier, do better than even the best ones today. But let me just illustrate a few examples just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things we are talking about. Agriculture. We all know that this is a big opportunity in the emerging markets to continue the structural change to more productive jobs. But if you look at the pushing the frontier, even in places like the US, technology today allows us to use sensors and be much more specific in how do you apply different enablers to increase yields by 10 to 20%. So in fact, agriculture is expected to be by far the largest end-use market for drones. So even if we think of agriculture as something where a lot of the change has already happened, it's actually on the frontier of many of the technologies. Automotive, lots of we hear a lot of the technological advancements on the right-hand side of that end. An example on the left-hand side would be China. There are more cars sold in China today than anywhere else in the world, and 36% of all workers in the sector work in China. Yet there are 150 and more individual automotive companies, a landscape very similar to how US had in the early decades of automotive industry growth. So really, there are big opportunities to consolidate, increase scale, and improve productivity that can translate into real productivity growth, even in industries like automotive. Retail, a sector that actually was one of the key drivers of the real productivity boom in the US in the late 1990s, a lot of that coming from really operational improvements throughout the value chain. And those opportunities remain both in developed economies and in emerging markets. And in addition to that, we can continue to push the mix of operation towards more productive ones. In emerging markets, largely moving from traditional to modern ones. For us here, a lot of it moving into online that can be 80% more productive in labor productivity terms than the brick and mortar. And last, but definitely not least, is healthcare. Industry that is large, below average productivity, and below average productivity growth. And these are the industries that are today creating healthcare and similar regulated and public sector industries tend to be the ones where employment is growing in developed markets, but productivity is not. And the good news is that there's a lot to be done through the operations in many ways. And I think just to give one example, nurses' time spent, they spent roughly on average of a third of their time with direct patient care. Being able to move things away from them can make a big difference on how do you actually, for example, capture data and reduce transitions, for example. And that's something that I think a lot of healthcare providers are working on. So all of this just tells you that clearly we are not running out of opportunities to improve productivity. And the overall impact, if you estimate it and we aggregate it up, is that we could get 4% productivity growth globally if we tapped into the full potential of what we saw on the ground. That is actually more than enough to increase the productivity growth by 80%, which would be the fully needed amount that we would need to fully compensate for the demographic decline. And perhaps the best news of that is that 3/4 of that is catching up, basically adopting techniques that we already know how to do in other parts of the world. And that really is something that a lot of the debate is now not talking about. It's a lot more talking about, are we running out of opportunities? We don't think so. There is plenty of them. A lot of that is in the emerging world. 80% there is from catch-up. But there is significant opportunities in the US and other developed countries as well. Roughly half of the productivity opportunity is still moving the lower performing operations into closer to the best practice. So 3/4 come from catching up. The last quarter is then pushing the frontier. And this, again, we are looking at opportunities that we see coming online in the next 10 years and being realistic and economical. That obviously underestimates the real opportunities that there are because we can't really see what kind of technological innovations are on the line. The fact that these opportunities are there doesn't mean they will be tapped into. Some of the things that we saw on the ground, we had already seen 10 or 15 years ago when we first time looked at many of them. The challenge really is, how do we make sure that the companies, that the industries are going to go through those changes and transformations that are often hard to do? And here, the challenge is that there is obviously no silver bullet. When we looked at what is keeping these from not happening, we found a very broad range of things that matter. And we categorized them into 10 enablers in 4 categories that you have all seen many of these, but collectively, these are the ones that will matter for global productivity growth going forward. For catching up, we need to continue to increase transparency and competition to provide the incentives to improve, particularly in the service and regulated sectors where we haven't seen that in the past. We need to continue to have incentives and the research capabilities to continue to push the frontier, something that made a big difference over the last 50 years. We need to work on the labor supply side. There are many opportunities of actually improving and speeding up women's labor force participation. And I think there's a lot of change happening, particularly with the elderly workers. And of course, there's more we can do to make labor markets more flexible, particularly to help the transition from those jobs where the numbers are declining to the new ones that are being created. And last, promoting cross-border economic flows. Really, a major driver of the last 50 years has been the reduction in trade barriers and foreign direct investment barriers that have helped integrate the global economy. I think we need to see much more of that, as we heard with the presentation with Jason, particularly in services. So this all may seem like a lot of challenges for the government. This is not just the government's job. We actually looked at specifically what share of all of these productivity opportunities that we see today would require some changes in regulation or government actions. And roughly, depending on where you're looking at, it's roughly a third, much more in emerging markets where the regulatory constraints are often still higher than they are in the developed regions, where a lot of that change actually happened in the last 50 years. But there are significant barriers in the developed markets still, about a little more than 1/10 of the opportunities. So there's a lot to be done, both by governments, but also by companies, employers, and even consumers, as we see, particularly the technology enabling different kinds of players to come into the market and change. So that, in essence, is what our research found. We are surely not running out of opportunities to improve productivity, both on the catching up or the pushing the frontier perspective. The question really is, how do we make sure there is strong incentives for everyone playing a part in the economy to go after those opportunities? And at the same time, it is a pretty tall order to be able to move across on so many fragmented opportunities. So I think we might want to take a moment and reflect on what is the kind of a debate we want to have on growth. One question is, what are the kinds of growth rates we should expect? There's nothing magical about the growth of the last 50 years, as James showed. What is it that we are expecting? What are the sustainability constraints of that growth? How equitable it is? We know that we are not going to see rise in the number of consumers or customers to rise. So even after the very important considerations for equity, even just from purely growth perspective, making sure that incomes of individuals rise, and particularly those who are most likely to spend them, that will make a big difference for growth. And last, how do we measure growth? How do we measure its GDP? Has it lived through its livable life? Across all of these, I think we already are seeing a good, robust debate starting, and we very much look forward to continuing the debate and working with our colleagues around the globe, as well as many of the thought leaders around, to hopefully be able to further not just the debate, but also some of the productivity levers around the growth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Brookings for having me here. It's a real honor and a great pleasure to be here to debate questions which are central to economics, as we've already heard, but they're also really central to the company I work for in terms of determining our future. As you heard by now, we really have two different questions on the table today. One is, how can we achieve stronger economic growth globally? And the very important point we just heard from the McKinsey report is that a lot of the stronger economic growth can be achieved just by spreading more evenly the benefits of technologies which already exist through the catch-up. And I think this is an extremely important message, though of course it will depend not just on policy actions, but also on a whole range of economic reforms, investment in infrastructure. It's not going to be easy or trivial. The second question is, how can we achieve stronger growth in countries like the US, countries which are already at the technological frontier? And in particular, how can we achieve stronger growth by pushing the technology frontier further out? And I think these two questions are really interrelated, because I believe the faster we can spread existing technologies across the world, the better our chance of pushing the technological frontier further out more quickly, partly because by spreading technology more widely globally at a faster pace, we will bring more people to push the technological frontier further out. And I think this is an additional argument as to why trade can accelerate innovation, as Jason Furman was arguing at the beginning. So the way I see it is, there's no doubt that the pace of technological innovation right now is accelerating rapidly. And what I find interesting is the acceleration is triggering a very schizophrenic reaction. So on the one hand, you have the secular stagnation idea of Larry Summers. You have the thesis by Robert Gordon that US growth, as we know it, is dead. And these are theories which are underlined by a very profound pessimism in our economic prospects and in the power of technology. And yet, on the other hand, you have an equally deep fear that technology is soon going to create mass unemployment, increase income inequalities even more than where they already are, and possibly push us towards a dystopian future where artificial intelligence brings the rise of a new generation of machines that will dominate and eventually replace us. So on the one hand, you have a view that says, these new waves of innovation we're seeing today are really frivolous, they're irrelevant, they don't even get close to approximate the transformational power of the great inventions of the Industrial Revolution, like the steam engine or like electricity. And on the other hand, you have a view that says these innovations are actually so powerful that pretty soon they will enable us to have the level of global economic output we have today with virtually zero labor input. And I think the fact that you have this schizophrenic reaction in itself shows you that we are indeed beginning to experience a technological transformation which is deeply disruptive and transformative. And it is in itself a signal of the uncertainty that we face at this point. So, as I mentioned, today, if you look at it from an industrial perspective, the pace of technological change is accelerating massively. At GE, we see it very clearly in our core sectors, which range from aviation to energy generation, from transportation to healthcare. And what is happening really is you're having the convergence of digital technology with physical, mechanical, industrial technologies. And this is gradually transforming what we know as traditional industrial machines into interconnected devices similar to our smartphones. And therefore, it's opening into industrial machines new dimensions across which the functionality can be expanded and improved. And it is tremendously transformational. We at GE have been looking at this for a few years now, and we've called this transformation the future of work. But we really see it as composed of three different and interdependent pillars. The first one is what we've called the industrial internet, which is essentially the Internet of Things in industry. And it is industrial machines being equipped with electronic sensors and therefore generating industrial-size amounts of data, which are then processed through sophisticated analytics, yielding better insights on how we can use more efficiently both individual industrial machines, but also systems of machines, whether it's an entire wind farm or the operation of an entire hospital. And this has enormous benefits. Essentially, what it brings you to is a move from a break and fix model, where you wait until the machine, whatever the industrial machine is, has something wrong with it, and then you go and fix it, to condition-based preventive maintenance, where you know enough about the behavior of the machine that you can go and fix the problem before the problem actually manifests itself. And therefore, you achieve a very significant reduction in unplanned downtime, so no more halting operations because something goes wrong. You get significant increases in efficiency and very, very significant declines in production costs and operation costs. So this is the first pillar. The second pillar is advanced manufacturing. And advanced manufacturing is really a combination of different things. So one is different production processes, and the most well-known is 3D printing or additive manufacturing. But it's also new materials used in these new processes, and it is also a digital thread which links together every element of an industry factory floor and links the factory floor with the supply chain and with the distribution channel. And what this does is, first of all, it shortens dramatically the cycle of design, prototype, produce. It makes the production faster, more flexible. It changes the nature of economies of scale. It moves towards democratization of manufacturing. Bottom line is it delivers a massive increase in speed and flexibility of how the industrial operations are organized and how they are operated. The third element of this future of work framework is the global brain, and that is the distributed intelligence of human beings across the globe connected by digital communication networks. And this is something that brings you crowdsourcing, open source innovation, and essentially turbocharges the pace of innovation. Let me give you just one example on this, which to me is just stunning. At GE, we pride ourselves in our ability to do innovation in-house. We have a big research department. We think we have the best engineers and scientists in the world in our fields of operation. And 2 years ago, though, we thought, after much internal debate, what if we try to do it differently? What if we try to open up our innovation process? And so we launched our jet engine bracket innovation challenge. What we did was we partnered with one of these crowdsourcing platforms, and we went to the engineering community and we said, here is the blueprint of the jet engine bracket as we do it today. And that's an element that attaches the jet engine to the plane. So simple, but pretty essential. And we said, we challenge you to give us a design which is at least as robust, which is lighter, and which can be produced with 3D printing techniques. We got a number of high-quality designs being submitted. The winning design came from a young engineer from Indonesia, somebody who had absolutely no background in aviation at all. The design was more robust. It was 80% lighter, 80. So the aviation engineers were completely taken aback. And for us, that was really a sudden reality check, because all of a sudden you realize, my God, this is really powerful, and it is disruptive, and we need to figure out how we use it, because if we don't, somebody else will. So, it really makes you realize how disruptive it is for companies and for countries alike. And now we have our CEO, Jeff Immelt, who today says, if you go to sleep as an industrial company, you will wake up a software company. And for us, the bottom line is we just don't get much sleep at all. And the reason is partly because there is too much to do to bring these innovations to life, but partly because we are deeply and painfully aware that this is disruptive, that we face a challenge that we cannot avoid, we cannot run away from, and we cannot afford to get wrong. And we are a pretty big, strong company which has been around for about 130 years. So if we think this is disruptive, I would submit to you it probably is. And it is disruptive because it works. Let me just give you a few examples, and they will come from the sectors that GE is involved in. So these are GE examples, not because I want to make a sales pitch, but because these are the examples I'm most familiar with, and so I'm most confident in the numbers. In power generation, we have new solutions based on the innovations I've just described that allow the wind turbines within a wind farm to change their operation in a coordinated way, so basically talking to each other as the weather changes and the wind shifts, so that they can maximize the efficiency with which they extract energy from the wind flowing through the farm. And this results in a 5% increase in annual output and a 20% increase in profitability. In the rail transport industry, we have solutions that allow the railway companies to, again, move to condition-based maintenance, so avoid failures, to have better monitoring of the health of the tracks, and to have better planning of the flow of rail traffic across the network. And what this brings you is an increase in the velocity of the network between 10 and 20%, and a 10% reduction in fuel consumption. Aviation, similar story. Similar technologies allow you to have significant reductions in fuel burn, plus reductions in delays and cancellations. Healthcare, which, as we've shown earlier, is one of the sectors where I think the advances are most striking, but also most important to us all. And there we have solutions which are cloud-based platforms that allow specialists to collaborate on the same clinical case instantaneously, remotely. They can share exams, they can share diagnoses, deliver better healthcare faster. We have analytics that allow you to reduce the cumulative exposure to radiation that a patient has, while still having sufficient high-resolution images in the diagnostics you're pulling through. And as we go forward in the coming years, we will see more and more of this, because what you will see in the next few years is the emergence of an industrial app economy, very similar to what we've seen happening on the Android and Apple platforms. You will see the faster development of applications for the industrial economy, again, increasing very rapidly the pace at which improvements in efficiency can be generated. So when I look at this, I think it's powerful. Is it powerful enough to change growth? I think yes, and the key word here is scale, because as this happens in industry, these solutions can be applied to the installed base of industrial assets, which is huge. And this is how they will start to have their impact reverberating throughout the economy. And by the way, also blurring the lines between manufacturing and services as we traditionally think of them. So we had questions before, as we think of the economy as divided between manufacturing and services, we have to change that, because manufacturing and services become more and more interlinked and indistinguishable. So I have no doubt that this is transformational, because I can see it at the micro level. But of course, as an economist, I'm also aware that we are not yet seeing it show up in the macro level statistics. However, and here you will have the pleasure of having two Robert Solow quotes in one 3-hour span. Robert Solow also said in 1987, with the computer revolution in full swing, but US economic growth weak, productivity growth slow, Robert Solow said, you can see the computer revolution everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And a few years later, productivity growth doubled and stayed at the higher level for about a decade. So we have to be careful not to speak too soon. It takes a little bit of time for these innovations to feed through the industrial system. And I think today we are in a very similar situation as we were when Robert Solow spoke. And with the difference that once productivity accelerates, I think because it feeds through industry, it will stay at a higher level for longer. So I tend to worry more about what do we need to do to make sure that innovation can continue and can spread its effects throughout the economy. And I see really 3 priorities. The first one for me is education. We need to make sure that people come out of the education system with the right skills. And for me, by the way, that means very simply starting with increasing the overall level of STEM literacy. We need to treat STEM literacy the way we thought of traditional literacy decades ago. But also we need to make sure that workers have the possibility to continue to learn and adapt throughout their careers. And I think all this requires better coordination and communication between the education system and industry. And it also requires the education system to make greater use of the new technologies that are around. The second priority for me is openness. And here I would support very strongly what you've heard from Jason Furman at the beginning in terms of the importance of trade. But we need flexibility in the economy. We need openness in the flow of data, ideas, and people, workers. And the third priority is cybersecurity. So this new wave of innovation is opening industry up to new vulnerabilities. They have to be addressed, but it's important that we address them in a way that relies and favors common standards and common platforms, avoiding the risk that we end up with a balkanization of the internet and the industrial internet. So to conclude, I think that human ingenuity is already poised to deliver the benefits of stronger productivity growth and stronger economic growth. It actually strikes me that even those who believe that technology will be so strong that it wipes us out, in a paradoxical twist of logic, seem to completely underestimate the power of the very people who are creating these waves of innovation. So I think we can be optimistic, but we really need to focus on the hard work ahead, the conditions we need to put in place for this innovation to deliver its benefits in the US and globally. Thank you very much.
So it's my job to talk quickly because we're a little behind on our schedule. Every slide I've prepared is a gem, of course, but I may skip over a couple. They're available for you if I don't talk about them specifically. Okay, so let me start. This is a chart of productivity. It's output per hour in the non-farm business sector, so it varies a little bit compared to what James and Yana were talking about, which was a GDP-based measure. So this is just, it takes out the farm sector, it takes out the non-business sector. So productivity growth in the United States slowed sharply around 2005. You could argue 2004, 2005, but it does seem to have slowed before the Great Recession. So that's not everyone agrees on that, but I think the evidence is that it actually started slowing before the Great Recession started. And it was a pretty dramatic decline from 2.8 to 1.6. And that has a lot of implications for living standards, for prosperity, for how the budget goes on. Now, if you look back a little bit further in time, and I think this was also mentioned, we've seen these sort of waves of fast and slower productivity growth. We had really fast growth after World War II until the early 1970s, and Robert Gordon and others have extended that back. So we had pretty fast growth prior to that also. So we've had a lot of rapid productivity growth during the sort of industrial commercial revolution that lasted all the way until the early 1970s. Then growth slowed down from 72 to 94, 22 years. Again, that was a difficult decade. We had slow growth in living standards. We had a lot of inflation, a lot of ups and downs, recessions in the economy. So that was a difficult period, again, with productivity growth at 1.5. Then, as Marco said, we speeded up for about 10 years. I've put here, this was my co-author Barry Bosworth's sentence, that it's an information technology, internet-led productivity revival. Some other folks at McKinsey have pointed out that there were also some other things going on, the spread of big box stores in retail and other areas where increasing competition pushed companies to be more productive. So I don't think it was all IT, but obviously IT was an important enabler, and actually the production of information technology contributed to the rise in productivity growth over that period. Then we've had another period of slow growth from about 2005 to the present, which, as I say here, seems to predate the crisis. Now, one of the things that I want to draw attention to, because it's not been generally agreed, particularly in this town, there's a lot of debate about it, and I'm not going to go into all the caveats, although they are important. Increases in labor productivity or decreases in labor productivity translate into what happens to real wages or real compensation. So this chart demonstrates that. So you can measure real wages in a variety of ways, looking at different price deflators, taking account of benefits or not benefits, and yet it comes through very clearly, whichever measure you use, that when productivity growth is rapid, wages grow more rapidly or compensation grows more rapidly. So that's a really important reason to be concerned about productivity, to look for ways to increase productivity. And the argument you sometimes hear that productivity has become disconnected doesn't matter. We don't find that to be correct. This next chart is one that I borrowed from Gary Burtlis. It may be a little complicated to read, but the message, I think, is fairly simple. And that is, in terms of schooling, the United States labor force has actually increased the amount of schooling that it's had. We've seen a substantial reduction in those people with a less than high school or a high school education, about flat in terms of those with some college, and a pretty steady increase in the number of people that have gotten BAs. So you hear a lot of talk, and I include myself in this, the talk about problems in the labor force reasons why productivity may be slow, if we don't have the right skills, if people are not taking the right courses in college or in high school, and those may all be true. But if we just look at the question, are we actually providing more education or are people taking more education, the answer is yes, and that doesn't appear to have slowed down particularly. I probably skip a little bit through here quickly. There are two productivity concepts. One is labor productivity, which has been the focus here. The other is total factor productivity. The advantage there is that you sort of separate out the contribution of capital accumulation. You separate that out from something which is called TFP, which is loosely speaking a measure of technical change, but also not just gee whiz technologies, but better ways of organizing businesses. A lot of things get dumped into that bucket. But it's interesting to note, and this is the sort of bottom line of this chart, is that during the period of the surge in productivity growth, the 10-year, the decade-long increase, it was both TFP and capital accumulation. And those two go together. It's not a coincidence. Obviously, the more capital accumulation you get, that increases labor productivity. There's more automation, more tools for workers to work with, and so that contributes to their productivity. I think it's also the case that when you have a lot of TFP growth, a lot of improvement, innovation taking place, that encourages investment. So that's a key issue, I think, when we think about secular stagnation. If we can get TFP going, if we can get that beneficial cycle of investment and innovation taking place, then both of them contribute and help each other in terms of getting growth. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. I think you know the answer that CBO has been revising down its estimates of GDP growth, potential GDP growth, which has a big effect on its budget estimates. So again, that's sort of one of the consequences of slow growth if we don't turn it around, if we don't do the things that Jana's been telling us we need to do in the United States to improve productivity, but continue to go slow, then we're going to get impacts on the budget. I'm close to finished, but it's not my fault we're running late, so I'm not going to take the entire burden here. So what are the explanations for slow growth? And we've touched on these, Marco touched on these. One view is that we've taken the low-hanging fruit, there are no innovations out there, and I think in fairness to, say, Bob Gordon, he agrees that there's innovation. It's just that he says, as Marco said, I think, that it's sort of trivial. It's people looking at their cell phones. Or it's not the same kind of innovation that we had in the 50s, 60s, where it generated big investments, it generated a whole new opportunities for labor to work in more productive jobs. So that's, I think, what they're saying is that the nature of innovation has changed and maybe overall it's slowed down. Now, lots of people are more optimistic. Marco is, I am. I think James and I have written together on this, saying that innovation is actually rapid. I was just at a venture capital conference in California that Brookings co-hosted, and I heard the phrase, innovation is taking place at the fastest pace it ever has. And so it just seems to these folks, and I agree, it just doesn't, the Gordon-Cohen hypothesis just doesn't seem to quite make sense. There's a lot going on. Maybe we're not taking advantage of it. Maybe it's not translating into output per hour, but there's no question there's a lot of this innovation. And Eric and his co-author do take the view that Marco took, I think, that it's a matter of time. We have to wait for this to flow through. There's some evidence for that. I'm not totally convinced by that argument. The third explanation I have up here is that a lot of this stuff is not being measured. And I gave a couple of examples here that things that are counted as intermediate goods. So a lot of so Google search, for example, I don't quite know how I'd function without Google search, but it doesn't, by and large, get counted as a final good because it's paid for through advertising, and therefore it's paid for by businesses, and therefore it goes into the national accounts as an intermediate good. The NBA and the National Football League are largely intermediate goods, except for the tickets that they sell in the stadiums. So there's a lot of strange ways we measure things that may not be capturing some of this innovation. Of course, to the extent that that search or other applications do improve business practices, that will get into productivity. One of the things that's not on this list that I think may be even more important is healthcare. Healthcare is a troubled industry in the sense that it hasn't organized itself in a way to be maximally productive, but it's still very innovative. There's a huge amount of innovation going on there. Treatments, medical devices, new drugs, all of that stuff. It's not counted very well. I won't say it's not counted at all, but it's really not counted very well. And there are sort of pilot programs to try to improve that measurement. And it's such a big part of the economy, as Jana said, 17% or so of GDP. So I think if we want to capture some of the innovation that's taking place, we need to change the way we measure output in sectors like education and healthcare. I don't think that's the whole explanation for the slowdown. I don't think there was some sudden collapse in the way we measured innovation after 72 or after 2005, but I think it is something we need to get on top of. The fourth one is that the Great Recession clobbered the economy, and of course it did, but did it clobber long-run productivity growth? And I think the argument there is much weaker. Past recessions did not do that, didn't change the trend that much, even going back to the Great Depression. And as we mentioned earlier, if the slowdown started before the Great Recession, again, that makes the argument that it maybe wasn't the recession. So the recession obviously was bad news, was terrible stuff for the economy. We're still kind of getting back on our feet. It probably has had at least a temporary over 5 to 10 years, depressing effect on productivity. But the case that it's the permanent, any kind of permanent setback, I think is weaker. I'm going to skip over startup companies and gazelles. Many of you know the literature on that. People like John Halterwing are at Maryland, but certainly to the extent that those companies are a source of employment and productivity growth, we're not getting as many of those. And then I'm going to finish with one of my favorites, although it's very unproven, and it links back to some of the earlier comments, which is that the nature of the innovation, and again, what Marco described and some of the exciting things he was talking about here, if you replace workers on a production line, if you make your manufacturing more efficient, or if you make your supply chain more efficient, and you end up not needing as much labor, those are productivity increases. We should welcome those. But if, unfortunately, the people that are displaced, or the people that would have taken those jobs, young people that go somewhere else, if they go to dead-end jobs with no training, no productivity growth, then you're diluting the effect of the innovation because it's not being spread broadly. It's being concentrated in the parts of the economy that can take advantage of this. And we know there is a split in the labor force, too, between those workers that have the skills, whether they're educational skills or whether they've skills they've acquired on the job that can take advantage of the technologies, and those that cannot. Okay, I've run through my time, and let's do a little on the panel. Thank you. So we're going to come up.
So we don't have too much time for the Q&A, but I'm going to borrow Martin's time for introducing Chairman Greenspan, because my guess is that people
all know who he is,
we
right?
do know who he is. So that's going to save us 5 minutes. Look, we've talked a lot about global aggregates and how the world is going, et cetera, but there's also something about how this applies to individual countries. And one of the things that interested me in the McKinsey report was actually the allocation of the outlook across countries. And so I want to start with Jana and really start with your China-India comparison. So you still have China basically with very rapid GDP per capita growth rates over the next 50 years, and India basically no change compared to the past, so no Modi effect, no acceleration of productivity growth. And in fact, your ordering, if you will, of developing countries is very similar to what it was in the past. Latin America fairly, fairly stagnant, not doing too much. Mexico, which you know extremely well, really not doing very well. And then China, South Korea or Indonesia, sort of the stars of Asia, and India a bit less so. Do you want to say a few words about that?
You are entirely right. It is by definition defined by past productivity growth rates. So in the data that we show, we basically assumed that assuming you can sustain the productivity growth rate of the past 50 years, this is what you would see. So in essence, we didn't make predictions on what the productivity growth rate would be in each of these countries. I think that's something that we can do. We can do it with different assumptions, etc. The answer would be dramatically different. It is extremely difficult to sustain productivity growth rate of 5% a year, which more than 5% a year, as China has done for the last 50 years, for full 100 years. So I think there's no question about that. However, it was more of, if you want, an example that illustrates what the impact would be, simply because a lot of people tend to do predictions based on this is how they have done in the past, let's just assume and extrapolate it more further. So it was a way for us to anchor the impact of the change in the demographics to some kind of a figure. So please don't read anything more than historical past to that. It is not our forecast of the future. It is just a way to illustrate the demographic impact to the trends we have seen in the past.
Okay, so James, let me come to you. I mean, a lot of this analysis is on the supply side. I mean, you look at sectors, you look at individual countries, you look at labor and capital and productivity growth. But, before we did have a question about the demand side, and many people are saying what really drives GDP and drives the economy is the demand side. Who is going to be buying all of these things, especially if we get into Marco's world where, it's all produced for us by somebody who presumably owns these robots, and we're not going to own the robots. So how do you bring that into the picture?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, the aggregate demand plays a very, very important role in the sense that if you don't have aggregate demand, in other words, if you don't have consumers and people can actually consume the outputs of economies, you actually won't have GDP growth. So that's the case. The good news is that globally, we've actually had increasing prosperity over the last decade or two. I mean, think about the number of people that countries like China and India have brought into the consumption economy, if you like, who now have enough consumptive power to consume a larger basket of goods. So that's been a big, big effect. I mean, China has doubled its GDP per capita in about 12 years, basically, in the last decade or so. India has done the same. So in that global sense, I think there is consumption, the demand will be there. The question is, in particular economies, and the US is one of those, if we don't actually find a way to improve the ability of households and consumers to consume more, either through increasing their income or wages in some fashion, we will feel the pain of that. So somehow we do need to solve, I think, what Henry Ford and others solved in previous decades, which is how do you make sure that, the nice thing about capitalism can only survive if there are consumers for the things that capitalism produces. So there has to be enough ability to consume the products and outputs of these economies. So I agree with you, aggregate demand is a very important part. And it's the reason why the questions about inequality are very, very important, but I think they're important in a particular sense in terms of the ability for households and individuals to make progress and be more upwardly mobile enough to be able to consume what they need to consume to survive.
So quick follow-up. I mean, when you go to your clients and with venture capitalists, et cetera, what do they talk about? Do they talk about like the techie things of all the cool new toys they're developing, or do they talk about inequality in the demand side and, how are we ever going to make money off this?
Actually, they talk about both. And I think, in the last 6 months to a year in particular, you'd be surprised the number of conversations that most technology innovators and leaders of these companies have actually spent in dialogues and discussions about how do we increase upward mobility? I happen to be involved in an initiative called the Merkel Initiative that's looking at how do we reinvigorate the American dream? And there's, half the participants, the private sector participants in that group are all the leaders of these technology companies in the private sector. So this is the real conversation.
So it's great to hear the private sector doing that.
Can I just jump in and comment briefly on something James just said? Because it's extremely important. On the issue of inequality, we tend to focus on inequality from a national perspective, no matter which nation you are in. But what James just pointed out is, in fact, that inequality on a global scale has declined dramatically at the same time as inequality within nations, within many nations, has increased. So we need to keep it into account because it's important for demand, but also because it's crucial that we learn how to address economic inequality within countries, but we have to do it in a way that does not backfire on global inequality, on inequality, income inequality at the global level. So we have to be careful to combine the two.
Marco, you clearly were cast into the optimistic camp. So are you ready here to say that in 2 years' time we will start to see the impact of all of this innovation showing up in macro productivity statistics?
Look, it's been pointed out that it will be a fool's errand to give you a 2-year horizon when it shows up. But am I confident that first of all, am I confident that within 5 years, you really start seeing the transformation of the industrial sector in a way which will be obvious to everyone, not just people who work in industry today? You will see it in the newspapers. Yes. Will it show up in greater productivity growth on, say, a 5 to 10-year horizon? Definitely yes. On that, I'm confident.
Okay. And then you think that that's going to be true everywhere in the world? I mean, you have manufacturing all over the world, and a lot of this discussion was about catch-up in other places. What kind of differences do you see in your plants in different places?
So we see differences which are very, very significant in productivity across our industrial plants. We have operations in about 150 countries in the world, so we really see it all over the place. And the differences are very clear. The differences we see highlight the need for different countries to do more for productivity to accelerate. One interesting case, we tend to think of some of the changes, the policy changes which are needed in emerging markets, perhaps because they are the most glaring. But you have very important structural changes needed in some of the advanced economies. And I will give you just one example, again, looking backwards. When Martin showed the acceleration of productivity growth in the US between 1994 and 2005, you saw some acceleration in productivity growth in other countries across the world, advanced and emerging, but some of them experienced very little. Europe was a case in point. And so a lot of it has to do with how flexible the economy is, but also how companies can adapt. There are studies from that period that show the European operations of US companies experienced much faster productivity increases than the local European companies. So it's not forgiven, and you can't take it for granted. There are things that need to be done by countries. The priority differ from country to country. It will definitely not be even the way in which these benefits accrue.
So, Martin, your charts largely focused on the US, but do you think that this same kind of story that you've talked about is also true in Europe and Japan? Are you as optimistic for Europe and Japan and productivity growth in these places as you were for the US?
Well, I don't know. I was terribly optimistic. I've written several things, and obviously I'm influenced by my co-authors, because when I write with James, I write a very optimistic view of U.S. productivity, and when I write with my colleague Barry Bosworth, it becomes much more tempered and not quite so optimistic. You have to sort of compromise your positions to your co-authors. Yes, I'm fairly optimistic that the U.S. will start to take advantage of the things that Marco describes. I think there is a tremendous pace of innovation going on. But I did raise the red flag, which is that what are we going to do with a lot of the workers that don't have that much skills? Are they going to be stuck in service jobs, low productivity service jobs? U.S. companies are actually very good at taking advantage of the workforce that's there. So they build their business model. So if there are a lot of cheap workers around, they keep the stores open a long time, the restaurants stay open till 11 o'clock at night or even all night in some cases. So we're very good at taking advantage of cheap labor and using it to contribute to overall productivity. And it does generate jobs. It's not that this is such a bad thing, but I think if we really want to take advantage of the innovation space that's happening, we need to make sure that the spread, the benefits of innovation are spread more evenly across the workforce. Now, I'm not answering your question, so let me quickly try to turn to Europe. There are so many difficulties in Europe right now that it's hard to be sure of what's the underlying supply side trend is that's taking place. I think probably there's been a lot of job destruction in the periphery and a lot of elimination of low productivity companies. So I think in principle, there's a base there for future growth. But the difficulty of dealing with misaligned price levels in the absence of an adjustable currency, the fact that some of those countries have not taken the steps that they need to make their economies more flexible, just the general debt and mess that they've gotten into makes it hard for me to see whether the benefits from those productivity advances are going to take place or not. I wrote a book about Europe when I was across the street at the Peterson Institute, and it was a fairly optimistic book too, and actually Europe had grown pretty strongly during the period where the US grew strongly. At this point, it's hard to pierce the veil and see what's going to happen.
Well, I was going to jump in and give you these two interesting, maybe polar opposites. I worry about Japan. Partly because there's been a decade or more of stagnant productivity growth. I mean, outside of, if you go outside of the manufacturing sector to the rest of the economy, productivity growth has stagnated and struggled quite a lot. So I'm worried about that. On the other side, to your earlier question about India, I'm actually optimistic about India, mostly because you're starting to see some interesting reforms. You're starting to see a lot of embracing of what technology can potentially do to that economy. And you still have an attractive demographic profile, which India will continue to benefit from. And as India continues to shift more of its informal economy into the formal sector, I think that will also lead to productivity benefits, because we know that as economies shift from more informal economies to more formal economies, productivity goes up. So that's an example of at least a large country, where I think I'm very optimistic about.
In 30 seconds, just on the point that Martin raised on skills, something I think is underestimated, but you see it in industrial sectors, is you still need somebody with a medium level of skills to go out and repair a gas turbine or a jet engine. But now you can send the technician in the field with more powerful instrument, industrial equivalent of an iPad, and makes the worker much more productive. So some of this innovation will actually augment the productivity at different levels of the skill distribution, might mitigate the divergence we're seeing now.
Yep. Great. Okay, let me open it up for one or two questions from the audience. Just wait for the mic, please.
Thank you, Ed, for your comments. I'm Paula Stern. I used to chair the U.S. International Trade Commission and continue to be very concerned and involved in competitiveness issues and innovation.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Martin. And my question really reflects one of my clients, which is the National Center for Women and Information Technology. And I noted that in this very rich discussion, women was not really talked about except once. And yet, when we talk about the bottlenecks from a policy point of view, from productivity, it seems to me, the lack of skilled labor, as was pointed out. Women, it seems to me, have not participated in information technology and in fact are participating in a declining fashion. And so there's an enormous opportunity here if we would just measure it and talk about it. And I would just urge you, when you talk about demography or if you talk about skilled labor, if you look at both the opportunities and the bottlenecks that can be removed, think about the women's piece here. not only here in the United States, but overseas. So what we don't measure, we don't change. And the five categories of technology, industries that you pointed out, Jana, IT wasn't in there. Information technology wasn't even in there for the future. And so I wonder how your McKinsey going forward is going to capture that. Or are we going to talk about this issue only with, as Martin did, from the TFP point of view? So if you would talk about the measurements, both in terms of demography and how we break out and change what we're measuring, both from IT and the women's point of view, I would appreciate it. And I think we could get a lot less schizophrenia about technology, by the way, if we had more women participating in creating the technology. I don't think we'd get the blowback.
Just a couple quick responses. Technology as an industry is very, very important. In fact, we've done lots of other studies where we've looked at the impact of technology. So that was not a deliberate, we didn't deliberately leave it out. We think it's an important part of the technology story. We just didn't focus on it today. Second, I did mention women. If you remember in the conversation about how do we improve labor participation rates, one of the big factors in that is improving the participation of women in the economy. And I think it's particularly interesting when you look at the United States in particular. If you look at both the undergraduate, at least in terms of the graduating rates at the undergraduate level as well as the graduate level, women are actually graduating faster than in much larger numbers in general. And then in IT, you're starting to see lots of initiatives now where the issues were at the entry level, companies are starting to do something about that and starting to highlight that. So I think your point about having more gender disaggregated data is really, really important, particularly in these industries that are going to make a big difference to the productivity potential of the economy. So couldn't agree more.
I'm going to
Give Jana a word here.
one more question, and then panel members can answer both the gentleman in the aisle.
Hi, I'm Fred Altman, and my question is on the social impact of all the increase in productivity, particularly at the high end. I think a larger amount of the conflict between conservatives and liberals really is on how much to accept and how resistant you are to the changes in the current economy. And obviously things like cell phones have changed things immensely, and with the other changes, they'll increase even more, which may lead to more disruption. I just wonder if you're considering that.
Okay, so why don't we just have last thoughts? Martin, any last thoughts?
Well, let me respond to that. I think in terms of inequality, I think inequality is a serious problem. I don't myself care that much if somebody goes off and founds Google and makes $1 billion and becomes one of the top 0.01%. I think that's not a loss to me or to the rest of the society. I think what's the bigger problem is if you have a large fraction of the workforce of the families that do not have adequate skills, whatever those skills are, to participate effectively in today's economy, and therefore are really feeling left behind and being left behind. That's the biggest problem.
Jana?
Quick thought on women. It is by far the biggest opportunity in emerging markets. Latin America, for example, some of the policies are changing that. In Brazil, simply putting more money into the women's side has translated into a net positive impact of women's entry. That will continue to be a big opportunity locally as well as globally. That is an opportunity for global companies too. On both the women as well as on the change, one of the things we should not forget, a big part of the miracle of the last 50 years has been the fact that there's new kinds of jobs being created, the speed of transformation is speeding up, and that can potentially be continuing opportunity for us as long as we keep our minds open. So just think about it. In the last 25 years, a third of all jobs created in the net new jobs created in the US have been in occupations that didn't exist or barely existed 25 years ago. So that was basically everything from obviously computer engineers, systems engineers, but also fitness instructors, medical technicians, particularly on the service side. A lot of those have been women intensive. So in many ways, looking at those differently and understanding that the job creation and the change is the one that will fundamentally change how the picture will look like 25 years from now, I think is very important, rather than looking back where the jobs came in the past.
Very briefly, on the less optimistic note of the challenges. So while I'm optimistic on the ultimate benefits of this innovation, I said it is disruptive. By being disruptive, it creates challenges and difficult conditions for companies and for individuals in the interim, and that cannot be underestimated. And for that, we need a better education system focused more on STEM and problem solving. We need a social safety net, and we need more efforts by companies on on-the-job training. That is essential in itself, but also to permit innovation to continue.
James, last word?
I think it's actually important to recognize that on-the-job training has actually been declining, both by the private sector, but also institutions in general. So I think it's important to keep in mind. But also it's important to recognize that our educational systems may not have kept up with all the different traits and skills that are going to be important to participate. Some of these don't even have credentials that exist yet. So we're going to need to think about how do we incorporate and pay attention to those as well.
Okay, thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking our panel.